Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all our friends, colleagues, alumni, students who are joining us this morning for our Great Minds conversation with Brahmal Vasudevan. And thank you in advance, Brahmal, for, I'm sure, a brilliant conversation that we're about to have. A couple of just quick notices to everyone that's joining online. First of all, please, we'd love you to engage in the conversation. So if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A function that should be at the bottom of your screen, the two little speech bubbles. And we will try to get through as many of those questions as we can, post them as and when during the hours as you feel like posting them. That would be really good. And secondly, this event is being recorded, so you will have a chance to watch back. If you've registered for the event, you will get a link directly to that so you can watch it back, but it also will be hosted on Imperial College's YouTube channel. So it should be available for everyone. So I don't think our guest needs very much introduction. Brahmal, thank you very much for joining us. I'm hoping this conversation will give us some insights into your journey. That sounds like a cliched word, but I feel like you've had a really interesting journey. Right way back to when you were a child and what inspired you. So maybe we could start there. What did you like to do as a young boy, and how did you kind of get towards thinking about engineering?
Thank you, Mary. Well, as I grew up in Malaysia, and in Malaysia, in the educational system, at the age of 15, you get divided into sciences or the arts, which I feel actually is far too early, because most kids at that age have absolutely no idea what they want to do. But so I decided, to stay in the arts, to stay in the science stream, and I went to do my A-levels in a small school in Bristol. And to be honest, I was really debating at that point whether I wanted to have a career in business or a career in engineering. I clearly had an interest in engineering and building things and so on. And at the age of 18, it's really tough to have to make these calls. And unfortunately, the UK system does require you to make these big decisions at the tender age of 18. I just felt that, choosing a career in engineering or, sciences gave me more options, that I could choose to remain in a more technical area. As opposed to, if I'd done business, I would really, or something, in economics or something, I would have set my path immediately, and I could never ever think about a career back in technical. So that's how I ended up, choosing to do engineering aeronautics, and I felt, even to today, I think it's been a great foundation, and as I've done many other things in my career since then. So.
Okay, so you chose engineering, which I think, I should confess a bias here. I sit in the Faculty of Engineering. Why did you choose to come to Imperial? And so, because in that process, at 18, again, it's one of those. There are lots of places you could have gone in the world. You've already travelled,
Sure.
halfway across the world to do your A-levels. What made you come to London and to Imperial?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think by default, my career choices and my school choices had already been limited to the UK. Today I know some of my kids, for example, decided to go to the US, and I think today people do think maybe perhaps more broadly about the US versus UK and Australia and stuff. But I was already in the UK, and so the path was set there. And I think as I thought about engineering, I really was looking for the best school and the best schools that one could do. And it was a toss-up, between Imperial and some other college in the Northeast. So I decided on Imperial, partly because there was this program in aeronautics that you could focus on straight away. Selfishly, it was a 3-year program there, and I felt that I wanted to get going faster. And unlike a lot of other programs that were 4 and 5 years, in length. And also the choice of being in, of course, a great city like London. So.
Okay, so you came to Imperial, so it was 1987, I guess. But for students, I guess for students now, and maybe for people who were at Imperial at the same time as you, could you just tell us a little bit what were your expectations of coming to the college, and what was it like when you arrived then? And I know you've been back to visit since, so you can probably see a big contrast.
Yeah, well, I came to visit, I think must have been around October 86, October 86, yeah. And that's when we were applying for universities, and then of course, came back much later. I didn't really have much expectation. I think it was, really very much focused on, getting a university. Of course, Imperial was different than some other universities, like Bristol and so on, which was perhaps more campus-based and more inclusive. And here you were in this place where you were, within a square mile of a university, and as soon as you stepped out, you're in the middle of this, enormous city. I think at that point, to be honest, Imperial was a much grayer place. A lot of buildings from the 50s and 60s that were not as impressive. And I think there's been a phenomenal transformation that, the leadership team has taken over the last 15 or 20 years that's really transformed this campus into this beautiful, modern and dynamic, institution, not only in the software, but also in the hardware with the, Foster-driven architectural transformation that's happened. So. Yeah, but certainly back in 87, it was not as pretty as what it is today. So
no, and now of course it's always sunny in South Kensington, also, which is great. So in the aeronautics department in your course, did you find that a big step from A levels? Did you did you ever question your choice? How did you find it being in the department and the cohort that you were with?
Sure. Well, I mean, it was great. I mean, it was a very small cohort. I mean, there were only 63 or 64 of us at that point, and I think that was nice. And I still have some very good friends who I went to college with at that point. Some who have actually stayed on and never left the square mile that we were in. But I think that intimate group was great. Lectures were much more personal. I mean, I talked to my kids about some of their lectures in the US, which are these massive auditoriums with 400 people. And at the end of it, the professor would just walk off the door and you never get to ask a question. It was much more interactive. You could, walk down, 5 steps and talk to your professor about questions you might have had on last week's lecture or this week's thing. So I like the intimacy, and of course the tutorials were excellent. I thought that was clearly a excellent learning experience.
Okay, so was there anything else kind of outside of learning that you enjoyed? I mean, you mentioned being in London. I guess because we spent a lot of time now thinking about the student experience and how to make sure that we provide lots of opportunities extracurricular. Did you have any of that, or was it very much departmental focused and work focused?
I think for us at least, it was largely departmental. I mean, we had some friends and friends of friends who were in Chem Eng and stuff like that that we used to see. But I would say probably 80 or 90% of my college interactions was that. I must say, it's quite funny. I say to people that when I was at Imperial for 3 years, I never walked into a museum, never ran Hyde Park, and I'm in London probably 3 or 4 times a year now. And every trip we're in a museum and we're walking or running Hyde Park. So I think I may not have fully appreciated the breadth of opportunity in London, and certainly, of course, living on a shoestring budget in 1987, didn't give you as many options to go for shoes and stuff like that.
That's true. I think that's still not unusual though with our students. I tend to do pulse surveys with the students courses that I teach, like, okay, who's been to the V&A? And normally it's about 20% of them. So it's no, I make them go.
And it's a place that we used to walk down every day, pretty much. So.
Okay, so and it is an amazing environment, right? I think if you're students listening in South Kensington, go to the museums, do that. Don't.
Yes, absolutely.
10 years later,
and it's free.
It's all free. Just go in for half an hour if you need to. And so I get the sense that you were still, even though you were in aeronautical engineering, you still, I mean, clearly your future trajectory shows that you're still interested in business. So when you graduated, what options were you considering, and how did you make, I guess, the step that next step?
Sure. Well, I must say there's a confession to make that very quickly. Within the first week, I realized that I should have taken that business degree that I was deciding or toying with. So I did come to a conclusion quite quickly that that my interests were more in managing, technical or other businesses versus, actually building things. But in those days, or even today, I guess, you can't really drop out because you'd have to start all over again. And my parents, who came from very modest backgrounds, they were professor and teacher and so on. I didn't feel that we had the flexibility to do that, So I said, okay, we're gonna move ahead and make sure we do the best that we can. But I think what was really good about Imperial was that in my time, at least, that every year there was a course that was economics or business related, right? So I think in the first year it was macroeconomics, the second year was microeconomics. It's about how companies behave. And then the final year was accounting and finance. And I think those mandatory courses, which everyone had to take, was really good, because I think it forces all of us to take a broader, view of life, right? And I think perhaps one of the strengths of the American system is that, you get this very broad education early in your life, and that those decisions on specific things can happen in your third or fourth year, and perhaps even after, So I do think that one of the challenges with the UK system is you're asking a 17 or 18-year-old to make these very, very important decisions very early in their life. And it's not surprising that, maybe half the class go out and do something completely different than what they studied.
Yeah, that's interesting. So there's a question, an anonymous question in the chat about why specifically aeronautical engineering? Was there something particular about that topic that made you choose it over other types of engineering, or a more general engineering degree?
Yeah, well, I think like many boys at that age, there's this fascination with, with planes and flying and stuff like that. So I think that clearly was one part of it. But I think when I visited, I think there was clearly a lot of talk that aeronautics was was a lot more than just aviation, but it was also around, airflows around buildings and airflows around cars and so on and so forth. So I think those were really some of the reasons that I chose aeronautics. Yeah.
Okay, and so then what was your first job on leaving Imperial, and how did you choose? I mean, how much autonomy did you have in saying this is where I want to go, or how much was it, at the time, what's available, what are my options? What was the job climate like when you graduated, and how much option did you have to really, this is the path I'm going?
Correct. Yeah. Well, I think a combination of things. So one is, at that point in 1990, it was very difficult for a foreign student to get a job in the UK, right? For companies to get work permits for foreign students was quite difficult. But I must say, my first choice at that point in time was management consulting, and I interviewed with McKinsey and got quite far down the track to probably the third or fourth round, and then they just said that, look, it was going to be very difficult for them to get a work permit, and so that hope was dashed. And I think things do happen for a reason in life. That I ended up joining a management training program for British American Tobacco, BAT, in Malaysia. And it was and really the decision to I didn't smoke before getting to BAT, and I think the decision to join BAT was really around at 22, was the experience and training that was going to come with working for a global multinational, right? And I think BAT was fantastic in terms of giving you general management training, exposure, and so on. I ended up joining the brand management program, as a management trainee, and then became a brand executive, a brand manager, and then eventually got transferred to London as an international brand manager, managing a couple of brands across the world. So it was an excellent overall experience in that sense.
Okay. So, and you could have kept doing that very comfortably, I think, for the rest of your life, right? But you then chose to take another path. So how did you make that transition to private equity, and what was it? Something you always wanted to do? Was it an opportunity at the time? What it seems like you had a secure good job that you were enjoying and you were learning a lot from.
Sure.
And then you changed direction again. So how did you
well, I think two things. So what happened after about a year and a half in a BAT, the first consulting firm started an office in Malaysia, which was BCG, and given my interest in it, decided to apply and got in, and very quickly realized that I didn't like strategy consulting. I found it very academic. And having worked in a company where you were coming up with strategy, implementing it, looking at results, pivoting and moving on, I felt that that was a lot more, interesting. And so I ended up, leaving consulting in a very short space of time, only 3 months there. But fast forward, so now we're in 1994. And I'd always had this interest, to go to Harvard Business School and to get an MBA from what, just as how Imperial is the best engineering university in the world. In my view, HBS is the best business school in the world, and was fortunate to have an offer to go to HBS. And for me, that was around, I was 26, 27 at that point in time. And it was kind of almost at the, at the peak period of your life that, you want to be in business school. And really there was 2 reasons for it. One is I wanted to really, broaden my management training and experience. And secondly, I felt that, I would meet lots of interesting people and maybe something might happen one day, So that was the 2 broad things that happened. And so in 95, I, moved to Boston to go to HBS. And it was a fantastic 2 years, when I was there. So.
Okay, so I guess it would be interesting to contrast, right? Harvard Business School and Imperial Engineering School. And only 5 years apart. Did you feel they were culturally very different?
No, I think in many senses they are. I think one is, you had an institution in HBS. I guess both had specializations, which was interesting, right? So you could really focus on things. I think HBS was larger. I mean, I always thought it was exclusive. When I got there were 900 students. I was like, well, I thought this would be more exclusive. It feels like a factory. But I think the difference, of course, being in the US was a big eye opener, right? I mean, this massive market with, just people from diverse backgrounds and so on and so forth. But also the style of teaching is very different, right? I mean, when you go to engineering school, you have a lecturer who's lecturing to you, and then you do assignments, right? At HBS, it's the case method. So there's never, ever a lecture. And sometimes you wish, can you just tell me the answer? And they want you to go through this process of discovery. So you have to read these, what ends up being 800 cases. And then you have to spend, initially hours, and which comes down over time. But I think that process of discovery, I think the most important learning that comes out is, I think HBS they're trying to teach you how to learn. They're not trying to teach you a specific topic or a specific subject, but they're training you to learn how to learn. And I think that's the biggest outtake that came up, because that's what we all face in life these days. We're thrown challenges and we have to fix it. And we may not have the expertise, but we definitely now have built a model of how do you tackle those types of problems.
And do you think it made a difference having had that kind of interim period of working between your undergraduate and the MBA? There's a question in the chat whether you'd advise a student to go straight to MBA, or is there a benefit of having that, I guess, that industry experience before you do it?
So I think it's an interesting question. So I think if you're in a technical space, right? So if you want to be an engineer, you want to be a doctor, I think you absolutely have to go straight into and do a master's or maybe even a PhD, right? Because what you're learning is very, very specific. I think in an MBA, there's absolutely zero reason why you should go and do an MBA, or for that matter, a master's in any type of management program straight out of university. You need to go into industry. You need to get some of the basics, from the companies that you're there. You need to have experience, you need to develop some experiences and realize where your shortfalls are. And that's when you get the best of the business education, because you can, the theory that you're learning, you can actually relate to, your past life. When I was at HBS, I think the average years of experience prior to getting to school was about 4. And almost nobody, I can say there were 0 people that came with maybe there were a few people at 2 years, 3 and 4 was like the kind of sweet spot. And I was, maybe just past that sweet spot at 4, at 5 years. But what they do say on the other extreme also is, don't go to business school, at least a full-time program, when you have 10 or 12 years experience, because what business school is doing for you is really accelerating your learning. What might have taken you, 7 years in the future, you get done in 2 years. And so if you go much later, you may already have a lot of the learnings that you've got from your work experience, and therefore you may not benefit from it as much.
Yeah, no, I think that's really, really good advice. Okay, so let's turn to private equity. How did you get involved with that, and talk us through the process of kind of making that step to that field and setting up your first fund?
Sure.
Well, what was that dynamic like? And then there's somebody in the chat wants to know whether it's they expect it all to be full of ex-bankers, and what is that community really like? and how did you make that step?
Well, I have to say that there were not a lot of things that ended up happening that I actually planned for. When I went to business school, I did not do a single subject in private equity because I never understood what private equity was or venture capital, and I never thought I would ever even consider it as a career, right? And I used to think of banking and private equity as these mercenaries who are arrogant and egoistic and, who lived in Wall Street and so on. So I always saw myself as somebody who would end up running a business or working in a business, right, in a leadership position. And so when I left HBS in '97, I went back to Malaysia and I worked, for a very successful entrepreneur who had launched various businesses, and I ended up being in the pay television business, the equivalent of Sky in the UK. And it was in its infancy. They just launched the satellites. The service was just up and running in 96, 97. There were 100,000 subscribers, and it was a really fun time, right? To really get in, to figure out how to grow the business, to expand into neighboring markets, to come up with different types of packages, how to price the service, and so on. And so that was a wonderful experience from 97 to 2000. But I was getting to a point that I felt that I needed to do something more entrepreneurial. And I thought at some point I would start my own company, and not knowing what exactly it was going to be. And it turns out that 2 of my friends from HBS had started a small fund in India. And they were very young, 20 and 29, I think. And they'd raised 64 million. And this was the last dot-com, boom back in 97 to 2000. There's another one going on now, which is even crazier. But and they were written up in Business Week as these, young whiz kids that were, blazing the trail in India. And so I sent them a congratulatory note, and a note came back saying, hey, why don't you meet us in Singapore? And so I met my old partner, Ashish, in Singapore in July 2000. And he said, why don't you join us and, help us build the business? And I, went back, talked to my wife, Shanti, and she said, great, let's do it. And so we made that adventure to get into private equity with zero experience in private equity in India, and a completely new market that I never lived in. But I figured that, it was some smart guys who I respected. It was a big country, right, with 1 billion people that was trailing the rest of the world. And it was in a space that was, building companies, investing in companies, and I think eventually what I really enjoy about what I do is that I think, private equity is the confluence of 3 areas. It's a confluence of investment banking, because you have to, raise money, you have to go find deals, convince people to take money from you. It's a confluence of consulting, strategy consulting, because in the companies you invest in, you have to have a strategic view as to where they're heading and how they should build or how they should evolve, and what strategies should be implemented. And then finally, I always say strategy is like 5%. The 95% is the implementation, right? It's, do you have the right people, and how are you implementing strategy? And and obviously lots of things are not going to work, and how do you pivot, and so on. And that's what keeps me going 21 years later in this space, is this constant mix between the 3 types of careers that I think people might choose. So
Okay, so there's a few questions people are interested in, kind of understanding this link between your engineering background and then your role in the private equity world, and some kind of sense that gives you a kind of an advantage, which I think I already asked you about this before when we met beforehand. And I think it's really interesting to understand this combination of skill sets that you have, and how much of an advantage that is, and how much does it make you behave differently to everyone else. And then one of our anonymous questioners wants to know whether it's impossible to do this without an engineering background, because it does, they say it seems like there's lots of people in private equity firms do have an engineering degree and then an MBA, and that whole balance of skill sets, and where are the opportunities. I've given you lots of questions in one there, Brahmal, but I think you've got it.
Yeah. Well, I must say that when I look at successful entrepreneurs or successful private equity people in the world, I do think they come from, a very wide range of backgrounds. There is no doubt that a large part of private equity, professionals come from an investment banking background, right? It's clear. I think there is a high degree of, relationship between, what people do in investment banking, what we do, right? It's clear. Mm-hmm. So I think people like Steve Schwartzman and, the guys from KKR and so on, they did. But it's quite interesting to see the background of others. So if you look at David Bonderman, who is the founder of TPG, he was a lawyer. And, he'd been working as a corporate lawyer for the Bass brothers, and then, over time decided that, he wanted to make the transformation. And so it shows that even lawyers can become, private equity. And then on the other end of the spectrum, if you look at somebody like Mike Morris, who used to run Sequoia, which is obviously one of the most successful venture capital firms in the world, if I'm not mistaken, Mike was a reporter. So I think what this shows is that whilst, there is a higher probability or higher percentage of people that come from a certain type of background, frankly, anyone with the right interests and, skill sets can actually be successful in this industry, right? And I think what's important is that you have an interest in the space, that you obviously have developed the technical skills, right? Obviously finance, but also so much of what we do is not just numbers. So much of it is around, communication skills, presentation skills, negotiation skills, convincing skills, right? And then there's a whole part around, sort of building businesses where, and I think there are lots of, very successful people who have built companies, and a lot of private equity firms. Frankly, I always say to my team that the single most important thing that we have to do in our companies is find the right management, so.
Oh, that's really interesting. So you've started to answer this question from Raj Kumar. I'm going to ask it as it's written. So it says you've invested in good companies such as Mr. DIY and CTOS, and then you've gone through to successful IPOs. What is it that you look for in a company and their management before deciding to invest? So you've started to answer this question. So maybe you could just expand a little bit about how you do that.
Well, we could be sitting here for a whole day when we talk about this. But I think, at the broadest level, if I had to decide, I think there are 4 or 5 big ideas, right? So I think firstly, we have to make decisions around where do we spend our time. And by default, we're fairly proactive investors. So we go and see companies before they need us. And so by default, we have to make a decision around space or sector. Right. And so we are growth investors. So we're looking for sectors that are inherently growing, and where, in 5 years from today, hopefully it's going to be 2 or 3 times larger. Right. And so you would see us, investing in organized retail, or, we're just about to do a digital bank in the Philippines, as opposed to investing in a mature industry. I often use this example of photography, and imagine investing in Kodak films, 20 years ago. You could see that industry was going to go through a phase of, dying. So we're looking for growth sectors. That's very important, because rising boats, obviously, rising tides sort of, carries lots of people forward. And that's why investing in markets like India and China and Southeast Asia is interesting, because all these countries are intrinsically growing. The second thing that we look at is when we look at companies, the second thing we look at is we try and understand what conceptually do they do. Very quickly, you got to figure out, okay, this is a business that's in retail. It sells to millions of companies. That's clearly a better business than investing in a company that has 2 customers, right? We look immediately at the financials, because it's like a report card, right? companies, investors, everyone's good at what I say, spinning the story.
Yeah.
But you can't run away from that report card. And so the report card tells us, how the business has grown, how profitable it is, right? And how much capital has taken them to get there. And that's a very important part.
Mm-hmm.
And that usually is a reflection of a few things from there. One of which is, what's the quality of management and how do you assess that? Well, I don't care what you're saying. This is what you've done in the last 5 or 10 years, right? That's one. I think the second thing that will reinforce this is the kind of industry that they're in, and by that I mean, is it an attractive industry? So obviously we talked about growth. We talked about, we like to be in spaces where our company has a unique proposition, that it has a defensible moat, so it's hard for new entrants to take, their business away tomorrow. And we look for companies where, they have a clear path to, double and triple their size going forward, right? So if I had to sum it up, are we in a growth sector? What do the numbers look like? Does it have good management? And, what's the threat of being, killed by competition or new technology, over the next 5 years? And then what's the strategy for growth? I mean, and then we're trying to do all of that in 1 hour.
Okay, that's very interesting. So I think these questions move on, and they're both from anonymous attendees. We've got some very, very shy audience today, Brahmal. But I guess the first one is having lived through the various tech boom and bust cycles, where do you think we are in the current cycle? And I think linked to that, there's a second question. But in the market today, companies are often overvalued, particularly potentially the tech sector, which is hard to value. And what's your approach to that? And I guess linking how we value some of these tech companies that have, even I can see they're ridiculously overvalued, right? And where are we in that cycle? You mentioned the first .com bubble.
Yes. So I think, well, I should say one thing, that when I went to Harvard Business, it was 1996, 97. I had a finance professor who would drum it in us every day that valuations in the tech space was crazy and that it made no economic sense, and you should never invest in the tech space. And so, fortunately, Andy Jassy, who was in my section, didn't listen to him and went to work for Amazon, and today's taken over from Jeff Bezos. But many of us, ended up saying, well, that's interesting, but it's never going to make any sense. And we didn't get into the .com cycle in 97. Frankly, we should have, because if you had started in 97, you would have presumably done reasonably well before the market crashed in 2000. But I will say that 3 things. At the end of the day, value is created in really 3 ways, right? Firstly, does your revenue grow, right? And in turn, does your profits grow? Are you being able to retain your margin? And thirdly, what is the price you paid, right? So you can have businesses that grew well, but you overpaid for an asset and you will end up losing money. So it's very important to have that in your back of your mind. And the foundation of all of this is cash flows, right? And in many cases, what the cash flow is going to be in 10 or 15 years. In a lot of companies, what they call the equity value of a company, 90% sits in what we call terminal value, which is something that you're forecasting very far ahead, right? So valuation is a difficult subject, and markets are not efficient, right? In general, if markets were efficient, it would be perfectly priced. We are living in a time which is unusual, which started after the GFC in 2008, where governments pumped a lot of capital into the markets, but I think since 2016, 2017, markets have been growing, and with COVID, there's been this explosion of central banks printing money, which has fueled many things: stock markets, commodity prices, and so on and so forth. And we just had this long debate last weekend when we had a firm offside around valuations, and it is absolutely clear by any metric that valuations today are far above fair market value, right? And you look at that by looking at what one metric is what they call PE multiples, which is what's the price divided by the earnings. And today we are running at several standard deviations above the normal, right? And we've seen this before many times, right? There have been many crashes, whether it was 1929, whether it was 87, whether it was 2000, and so on. And so there is a crash coming, right? Now, the question I can't tell you, is it tomorrow, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months? And all my staff remind me, I've been saying this for 3 years, so they don't believe me anymore. But what I can tell you is that when bubbles rise, people miss out and then they want to jump on. And so it keeps going and going. And it doesn't help with the government pumping all this money and it's gone crazy. But I think you are seeing cracks. And I think it's hard to tell what is going to be the thing that, eventually flips this. I think inflation is one, which we're starting to see now. That's a big shock to the system. But I think at some point, these, especially in the technology space where valuations have run up dramatically, there's not been enough discipline on these companies using their cash to actually eventually get to a profitable business. They've been so used to getting so much money thrown at them at very high valuations. They've been blowing this money on acquiring customers at a loss, and so I won't mention names, but a very successful ride-hailing company just went public in the US, at 40 billion, the stock is down 20%. Now that company has burned $13 billion of capital over its life, still continues to lose $3 billion. At some point, investors are going to say, show me the money. And when you can't show them the money, that will be a major point in which, corrections happen. And that's what happened to WeWork, if you remember, about a year or two ago, where, they were building. At some point, the investors said, I'm not prepared to put in money at this valuation anymore. And the next round was done at maybe 25% of what they were asking for, right? So short answer is, I think markets are severely overvalued. And I think the smartest investors in the world, like Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett, have just come out to say that as well. I think there is a correction coming. This is not a time to take lots of risks. It's better to, I think, to be taking money off the table and wait for a more normal time. And unfortunately, when markets correct, it can take almost up to 2 years before the dust settles, and so don't jump back into the market when you see the first 20%, correction happens.
So there's a somewhat cheeky question in the chat about probably looking for a tip. And if you could tell us this, we'd all be very grateful. What sector do you think, or what companies do you think are undervalued, Brahmal? maybe you're not prepared to answer that. We've got a very specific question from Paul Robinson, who's the current head of Aeronautics Department. Hi, Paul. And you mentioned the dot-com bubble. Does blockchain technologies, is that a different challenge? Where do you see blockchain in the whole investment space?
Well, I must say I'm not an expert on blockchain, and I don't fully understand it. And I have a simple brain, so I can only process limited numbers of digits and so on. I mean, clearly there is a role for blockchain. It's been demonstrated to work in various things and so on. I think the hard part, which I think people struggle with, is the hype from the reality, right? And with technical stuff, many times I feel that people who are investing in things that are more technical don't really understand, how it works, and how do you translate that into a business model that can actually be sustainable over the long period of time, right? Over a long period of time. And so I think the challenge, I think, for blockchain is going to be, finding business models that, can generate, real revenue and profits and be sustainable over the long period of time, And, but I think the beauty of venture capital is that, money is thrown at lots of crazy ideas. There's a high degree of failure rate, but in the end, there are great new success stories that, will drive the future of, the world, And so I'm sure that there's room for blockchain in many things. But often when I hear about how blockchain is used, I always say, like, well, we can do that already in this way. Why do we need to go through this, crazy, sophisticated way of doing things, So I think sometimes simple is better. So.
Okay, so you've just used the word sustainable in a few times there, Brahmal. So I'm going to just switch tack a little bit. We're just on the back of COP26. We've got a existential crisis that needs, I guess, a concerted effort across business and governments and research and citizens. What is the role of private equity and investment in, I guess, often in tech, in thinking about some of these, I guess, global challenges, and how can it operate in a way that's still sustainably profitable, right, in terms of the market, but delivering those additional benefits or different benefits?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question. So I think if you left, money makers to themselves, and if they had all the money in the world, they would just be mercenaries, right? They would just focus on business and, find the best ways to maximize profit. I mean, the reality is that in private equity, we raise money from institutions, and a lot of the money comes from pension funds and so on and so forth. And I think that a really important change, I think, happened probably, in private equity around the 2010 period in the West, and more recently in where we are in developing countries, where I think pension funds and governments and this started pushing the whole subject of ESG. And the focus around not just environment, social aspects, of doing things, and also governance. I think we were always pretty good on the governance side, but the E and S were not necessarily areas that we were focused on, because we're all focused on just making money. And I think the good news is, with some pressure from our investors, with perhaps also as private equity evolved, right? The industry, the people, obviously people have wealth now, and we start thinking about, we need to start doing the right thing, morally. And we also finding that actually doing the right thing actually means you actually can make better returns, right? Because what you're finding today is that the markets give you a better valuation, a better multiple, if you are more ESG friendly, which is also good. So I not only want to do the right thing because it's morally the right thing to do, but also there is an economic benefit in doing this, right? And so I think that's nice to have both those things coming together. And so I think private equity is an important transformation point. We ourselves have, made this big commitment. Our team is called CXG. We're trying to make it more sexy. So it's, it's Creador times good. And we've hired, we've got 2 people. We're going to have 4 people in this. And we're going through this, we've always, I think, been better at the kind of industries we've chosen, right? So we invest in retail, consumer, financial services, healthcare, and business services. So we generally have avoided sectors that are, more, that creates more danger to the environment, pollution and so on and so forth. So it's a bit easier for us, but we've always had an upfront audit around where do our companies sit, not only on things like pollution and so on, but how we treat foreign workers, gender equality, and issues like that. So we have an audit, and then we work on a plan over the 4 or 5 years that we own these businesses to improve every metric, over time. So if, for argument's sake, if we have, 1 out of 6 members of the board are women, we hope that, by the end of it, we have at least 30 or 40% of the members are women. Foreign workers and how we treat them, migrant workers is another important subject that's going on in Malaysia today, where many manufacturers have not really treated them to the standards that, we would treat ourselves. And that's really disappointing, because they're such a critical component of our ecosystem. And I think there's a lot more focus around, getting minimum standards that are, that are acceptable and so on. So I think there are a number of initiatives. So I think it starts with the vision, but I think the good news is the American or the Western private equity firms have started this journey, in the 10, 11, 12 period. And I like to think that we are one of the few that is really driving the agenda in our part of the world as well.
And how do you tension all those different factors in making a decision? Is it that you have kind of a a set of flags where okay, unless these, I guess, ethical positions are met, we don't invest, or is it more grey than that? I mean, have you defined where your lines are as a company? Sure.
Yeah, no, I think it's clear for us. There are certain boundaries that we wouldn't touch, right? I mean, if a company was using child labor or was polluting the environment, so on and so forth, I think there are clearly things we would never touch, even though we thought that we could transform those businesses. So I mean, for example, we don't invest in gaming, we don't invest in alcohol, we don't invest in, forestry and stuff like that as
Yeah.
well. So there's a certain things that we've already set our boundaries to. I think the second aspect is, and in a debate that, yesterday, in fact, we have a consultant who had worked with one of the largest private equity firms that is helping us in our ESG transformation. And we're talking about what's more important. If you had to rate a company at 1 out of 10, is it more important to invest your ESG efforts in taking the guys who are at 1 and getting them to average? Or if you have a company that's already very good, let's say they're a 7 out of 10, and now, you got to take them to 8, right? And you're not going to make as much impact, but they're still going through a progression. So, I mean, these are some philosophical questions that we're dealing with. But clearly, I think that the most important thing is we have to, at the very minimum, reach minimum acceptable standards. And then we have to have this quest on how do we continuously improve ourselves and, raise the bar in all that we do in this area.
Okay, no, I think that's a really interesting perspective. So there's a question in the chat, and I think it kind of links to, you've clearly had a very successful career, and you've tried lots of different things, and you've seemingly excelled at all of them. So but I'm assuming there must have been some setbacks, and that requires a level of resilience. And so can you maybe talk about where has there been setbacks in the journey, or how have you navigated some of the challenges?
Sure. Well, maybe I'll talk about 2 ends of the spectrum. So, when I started in private equity in my old firm, Chris Capital, back in 2000, this was just after the dot-com crash had happened. And, we were fortunate that we had, there was a first fund, but we'd also raised a second fund. So we at least had money. But the challenge was actually, it was a very quiet period. There were really not many companies that were growing. It was difficult to invest a lot of capital. And so we went through these years, fairly lean years, 2001, 2002, where, we were not deploying a lot of capital. I think we may be deploying $20 or $30 million a year. And, there's cause to question yourself sometimes, did I make the right career decision? I'm leaving this thing, taking my family to the US, and is this going to be what it's going to be like forever? And I think it's really important that in our industry, especially, you can go through times like now, which is absolutely crazy, where there seems to be a deal every day. But there will be a crash, and then we're going to go through a period where it's going to be really quiet and lonely, and lots of value is going to get destroyed. But the cycles are long in our industry. The cycles can be 6-7 years, right? And so you have to have perseverance, I think, and patience, that in those lean years, to have firstly the guts to invest in great businesses, but also to have the patience and wait for that cycle to come back. And we were very lucky that India started to take off in 2003. We were well positioned because we were one of very few firms in India. And then we raised our third fund in 2004, which is a $250 million vehicle, which we invested in 18 months, and we raised another $550 million. We also invested another 18 months, and those funds did incredibly well. But if we hadn't started in 2000, we would not have had the same success, because we would have come too late, as unfortunately many people did in 2006 and 2007. So I think the moral of the story was really, having the patience and perseverance to, and to invest, in those lean years. I think the second part is, having been at a very successful firm with lots of great friends, and, my desire was really to move back to Malaysia, because this was home, and my parents were getting older, and my in-laws were getting older. My children were getting to high school and middle school, and I felt it was the right time to move in 2011. But my partners were not interested in doing anything outside India. And so there was this conundrum of what to do next. And so I said, okay, let me start again. And I thought it'd be really easy. I mean, we were managing $2 billion. We did 43% for 11 years. It should be a walk in the park. But you realize that actually, starting again is also not easy. And once we had lots of people that knew us, there were a lot of skeptics of whether we could replicate what we had built at Chris. The questions around, was it you, or was it your colleagues that really, built the business? And so we went through a very difficult period, I think, 2011, 12, where, we were trying to raise $388 million. met 350 investors. 90% of them said no. And the worst meetings are usually where they don't ask any questions, and at the end of the meeting they say, very interesting, and we will analyze and come back to you. And that means they haven't listened to a thing, and they said no. I mean, and the best meetings are usually ones where they ask you lots of questions. But anyway, 350 meetings, 90% says no, and it does take a lot when you know that when you're going to walk into a meeting and there's a 90% probability it's going to be a complete waste of time. So lots of travel, all around the world. And we struggled to raise $130 million, right? And which was kind of barely enough to get going with the firm. We had 3 offices at that point: India, Indonesia, and Malaysia. And but I think that investment that we made in the early days was important. That perseverance of going out, traveling, getting the name out there, meeting the 350 people, put us on the radar. And when we had some initial success in Fund 1, and when we went out in Fund 2, people had heard of us, and we were lucky to get a leading US educational institution in, and that became the transformation. All those people who never wanted to do the first fund, because it's always a high-risk venture, now felt that, okay, you guys survived the first fund, you're now more institutionalized, you have a track record, let's give you a little more capital and see how it goes, right? And fortunately, we invested well, and the subsequent funds then became easier, because we could demonstrate performance. But I think clearly there was a time, I think, in 2011, 2012, and I said, look, I'm 43, I'm 44, I've been doing this for 22 years. This is just too hard. But I think we were lucky, and I was lucky to have some great partners with me who, persevered together and helped me build this firm that we have today. So.
Okay, that's great. So there's a few questions relating to the future. So, Zen Heng asks, what are the hurdles for you and Creador facing into 2022 and beyond? What are the greatest challenges in the sector in the next 5 years? And you mentioned a little bit that the tech bubble, but so beyond that, are there other challenges that investment private equity is facing, either locally, nationally, globally?
Well, I think in private equity, really you have 4 things you have to do: raise money, find deals, build companies, and sell them. And if you don't do one of them, the model collapses, right? So I think we're living in a time where raising money generally is easier. It's not always easy, but it's easier. I think the challenge is today is still finding good businesses at the right price, right? There are lots of, you can deploy $50 billion tomorrow. There's enough things out there, but can you get the right company at the right price? That's the single biggest challenge that we have, I think, today, right? And I think on the building companies, we have a great team, Creador Plus, which is run by my partner, Kevin, and where we provide consulting input into companies, and they, in turn, hopefully grow faster. So I think we do a pretty good job there. And I think we've been lucky, that we've backed some great companies. We've been able to realize them, well. But if you ask me in the near term, I think the biggest challenge we have is in the second bucket.
Okay, so I'm going to come back a little bit to students and their needs, and there's a couple of questions. So somebody wants to know what you look for when you're hiring someone, and linked to that, what are the key skills for success in the corporate world that Imperial graduates should be working on now? Sure. And I guess linked to that, for us at Imperial, what are the things we should be teaching our students that's different to what you had?
Sure.
Just a few years ago. Yeah. Okay,
fair enough. Well, first thing, we only hire students from Imperial College, of course. So. But Imperial certainly has been a great school for, and a number of our colleagues are from there. But I think, look, for us, a lot of people who come to us don't necessarily have experience in private equity or finance. And that's an important starting point, right? I think we've taken the view as, we do hire, people at entry level, and then of course we have more experienced people. So I'm going to talk more about fresh graduates, right? Because this is the universe that we're talking about. So I think we look for, I would call it general, personality skills. Can you communicate? Are you articulate? Can you hold a conversation well? And that's one important area. And sometimes we find, sometimes, people who come from a technical background can suffer in that area, and I think those are important skills: communication, presentation, a little bit of charisma and so on. I think the second part that we look for is analytical skills, right? And so again, we're not looking for finance or technical skills, where we give people, problems, and we're looking to how they approach a problem, and a lot of what we do, I feel, is common sense. So we're looking for how they would rationalize and how they would take that forward, and I would say really these are the two most important, skill sets. And I do think that engineering or a technical degree or, the sciences does give you a structured process of thinking through problems and how to solve them. And so that's important. And I think within analytical skills, we're looking for a combination of, quantitative skills, being able to, crunch numbers and do mental maths and stuff like that, but also qualitative, aspects.
Yeah.
And so at the entry level, these are the two most important skills that we look for. The rest we feel we can impart into our colleagues that join us. So that's one part. Remind me, what was the second question?
It was, I guess, what current Imperial students, and I think you've kind of said what they should be thinking on, but are there things that you think degree courses need to change, or are there skills, different skills that, I mean, we hear a lot about, data literacy and, programming and, talking about,
Sure.
A whole layer of extra skills beyond kind of the discipline specific. Should we be doing more of that? Should students be doing that by themselves? And I guess just to round up then on top of that, what advice would you give to a current student?
Okay, no, that's a good question. Well, I think the first subject that everybody should be taught is history. And, I think I wish I learned more about history when I was in university. And I'd say history, I mean, learning from how other people had done it hundreds of years ago or more recently, because I think, you can just speed up your learning curve by having seen how, other companies or people had approached problems in the past, right? And HBS is a great example of, case studies that are essentially learning historically how people had solved problems. And I think that's the most undertaught subject in education, and in particular in an engineering school. That's one. But I think in my time, I certainly think that those general management subjects were very helpful. I hear that today that is now become an option and not compulsory. And I do feel that even though we are teaching in a technical school, that there should be, at least 10 or maybe even 20% of the subjects should be a little bit broader, that should give students a view of the opportunities that are out there. So teaching, there's no harm in teaching, first year macroeconomics and microeconomics, because those are universal skills that they may need in elsewhere. I mean, there's a question whether you should know accounting or not, but I think that can always be helpful. But history or some other general subject. And I think where the American universities do a good job is they give you that first 1 or 2 years where you're, teaching philosophy or some other subject and giving you that foundation. So that's one part. And I really think that Imperial should maybe do a bit more of that. I think the second part, which is probably a much more difficult challenge for Imperial, is, do people need to make these decisions on civil, aeronautics, chemical, and materials at the tender age of 17? Or should some of these programs be more general in the first year, and maybe, a second year, it's a 4-year program, and then allow them to make those decisions, when they're 20, and when they've had a chance to see what these subjects mean. But I know it means like completely changing everything, which I'm sure it's very hard to do. But I mean, those are some of the things I feel.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. And it's certainly an active conversation here. And I think I did hear us almost come full circle and going back to the museums, Brahmal. Whilst you're Imperial, learning some history, and also we should incorporate history into our learnings. So we're actually, unfortunately, at the end of our time, and I do apologize to anybody who's put a question in the chat, and we've answered quite a lot of them, but we could keep going for another hour, I'm sure, which I think is a testament to how interested our audience has been in this conversation. So it just remains for me to thank our audience for joining and for interacting. It's really nice to have so much feedback from the audience. Hopefully you'll also have a chance to watch this back and learn a little bit more about Brahmal. And to thank, obviously, Brahmal, for your very generous time and honesty, I think, in answering the questions. It's been really a privilege to talk to you. Thank you.
Mary, thanks very much. It's been a pleasure. All the best.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Take care. Bye.